Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're taking a deep dive into Ludwig Wittgenstein's Brown Book. Now, you might be thinking philosophy, that sounds heavy. But trust me, Wittgenstein is anything but dry.
He really is a unique figure in philosophy. He's constantly challenging our assumptions,
Yeah,
pushing us to look at language in a fresh, almost playful way.
exactly. And the Brown Book, even though it was never officially published during Wittgenstein's lifetime, is a perfect example of this. It's like peeking into his workshop, seeing how he wrestled with these big ideas about meaning, understanding, and how language actually works.
It's fascinating how, even in these personal notes, which were more for him to work through his ideas, there's this incredible clarity and depth.
Right. So before we jump into the specifics, can you give us a quick overview of what we're getting into with this deep dive? What are some of the core themes that Wittgenstein explores in the Brown Book?
Absolutely. Well, the Brown Book is essentially about how we misunderstand our own thinking processes because of a misunderstanding of how language works. He uses the idea of language games to show how meaning arises from the way we use language in specific situations.
Okay, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
But how does that play out in the book itself? Where does he actually start with this exploration?
Well, he begins by questioning some of the traditional philosophical assumptions about the nature of language. We tend to think of language as a system of representation, words standing for objects or ideas, but Wittgenstein argues that this picture is too simplistic.
So he's pushing back against this idea that there's a one-to-one correspondence
Yeah,
between words and things in the world.
exactly. He points out that words can have multiple meanings depending on the context, the purpose, the way they're being used. To illustrate this, he introduces the concept of language games.
This is one of those ideas that has become so associated with Wittgenstein. Can you remind us what he means by a language game?
Essentially, it's a simplified example that illustrates how language functions in a particular situation, like the builder and assistant scenario he describes early on.
Oh, right, where the builder only have a limited set of words to instruct their assistant, to bring different types of building stones.
Precisely. It might seem like a trivial example, but think about it. This limited vocabulary is perfectly adequate for the task at hand. It highlights how meaning is tied to practical activity, not some abstract realm of mental representations.
So it's not about having a dictionary definition in your head for every word, but rather about knowing how to use the word within a specific activity.
Yes. And what's fascinating is that as Wittgenstein expands this language game, adding numbers and the ability to point, he shows how even small changes can profoundly alter the nature of the game itself.
That's a really neat way of thinking about it. And,
Yeah.
it makes you realize that we're all constantly participating in these language games every day without even realizing it. Ordering a coffee, writing an email, having a debate. These are all language games with their own rules and purposes.
That's a great observation. And this diversity of language games is crucial to understanding Wittgenstein's point. He's trying to break us free from this idea that there's one overarching system of language that governs everything we say and do.
So he's not saying that there are no rules to language at all,
Right.
just that the rules are more fluid and context-dependent than we might initially think.
Precisely. He uses the analogy of tools in a toolbox. Each tool has a specific purpose, and we learn how to use it effectively within that context. Language is the same way. It's a toolbox filled with different instruments for different tasks.
I love that analogy. It makes Wittgenstein's ideas so much more approachable. And speaking of tools, one of the words that Wittgenstein really digs into in the Brown Book is can. Why is this word so important for him?
That's a great question. Can is important because it helps to illustrate how we often get tangled up in our own thinking. When we try to analyze language in isolation, detached from its practical use, we might think of can as referring to some inner capacity or potentiality, but Wittgenstein argues that this can be very misleading.
So he's not saying that there's no such thing as ability or potential,
Right.
just that the way we talk about it using words like can lead us into philosophical dead ends.
Exactly. He's trying to shift our attention away from these internal mental states and toward the outward, behavioral aspects of language. For instance, when we say this tool can cut wood, we're not necessarily making a claim about some hidden property of the tool itself. We're describing its function, its role within a specific activity.
So the meaning of can is tied to the way the tool is used, the purpose it serves, not some abstract notion of potential.
Precisely. And this applies to all sorts of situations where we use can. When we say, I can finish this project by tomorrow, we're expressing a commitment. making a prediction about our future actions. It's about how we use the word in a particular context, not about some mysterious mental capacity.
I'm starting to see how this idea of looking at language in action in its real-world use is central to Wittgenstein's whole approach. And it makes you realize just how much philosophy has traditionally focused on analyzing language in a very abstract, detached way.
You're absolutely right. And this is where the Brown Book gets really interesting. Because Wittgenstein isn't just critiquing traditional philosophy, he's offering a new way of doing philosophy, one that's grounded in the actual ways we use language to navigate the world.
And this is where I think another key theme of the book comes in, the idea of the particular. Can you help us unpack this concept a bit?
Of course. Wittgenstein argues that our use of the word particular often creates the illusion of specificity. We might say, I recognize this person's face, as if we're grasping some unique feature that sets them apart from everyone else. But what are we actually referring to?
It does feel like we're trying to pinpoint something elusive, something that we can't quite articulate, but that we feel very strongly.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein argues that the sense of specificity is often misleading. We might think we're identifying some essential property, but in many cases, we're simply expressing a certain attitude, a way of focusing our attention.
So it's not that we're wrong to feel like we recognize something particular, but rather that we often misunderstand the nature of that recognition.
Yes, he gives the example of looking at a simple drawing of a face and saying it has a particular expression. We might feel like we're perceiving something unique about the drawing, but really we're projecting our own interpretations onto it, creating a sense of specificity that might not actually be there.
Like we're adding a layer of meaning that comes from us, not from the drawing itself.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein argues that this tendency to project, to create these illusions of specificity, is something we do all the time, not just with visual perception, but with feelings, memories, even abstract concepts.
So it's about becoming more aware of the ways in which our language shapes our experience, the way it can both illuminate and distort our understanding of the world.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's what's so brilliant about the Brown Book. Wittgenstein is constantly encouraging us to pay closer attention to how we actually use language, to become more self-aware of our own linguistic habits, and to see the ways in which language can both help and hinder our understanding.
This is such a fascinating deep dive already. We've only scratched the surface of the Brown Book. But it's clear that Wittgenstein has a lot to say about the complex relationship between language, thought, and the world around us.
Absolutely. And as we move forward, we'll see how these ideas about language games, rules, and the particular come together to form a truly groundbreaking philosophical perspective.
I can't wait to explore more. This is one of those books that really makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about how language works.
And that's precisely what Wittgenstein wants us to do, to step outside our comfort zones, to challenge our assumptions, and to engage with language in a fresh, critical, and ultimately more meaningful way.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Wittgenstein's Brown Book. We've been exploring how Wittgenstein uses the idea of language games to challenge traditional assumptions about language and meaning.
Great. And it's clear he sees our everyday use of language as a key to understanding philosophical problems. Absolutely. And one of the most striking examples of this is his analysis of understanding. He argues that we often get tripped up by thinking of understanding as a purely mental event, like a light bulb suddenly switching on in our head.
I think we've all had that experience of suddenly getting something.
Yeah.
But it's hard to explain what exactly happens in that moment.
Precisely. And this is where our language can mislead us. We might say things like, I finally understand, as if we've grasped some elusive mental object. But Wittgenstein argues that this picture is often misleading.
So he's not denying that we have experiences of understanding.
Right.
He's just questioning the way we typically talk about that.
Exactly. He's asking us to look beyond these introspective reports and to focus on the outward, behavioral manifestations of understanding. For example, think about a time when you were learning a new skill, like playing a musical instrument.
Okay. I'm picturing myself struggling to learn a new chord on the guitar.
At first, you might fumble around, make mistakes, feel frustrated, but with practice, you start to get it. Your fingers move more smoothly, the sound becomes clearer, and you can even anticipate the next chord change.
Yes. And in that moment, it's not like I'm consciously thinking about every finger placement. It just flows naturally.
Exactly. That's the point Wittgenstein is trying to make. Understanding often manifests itself in our ability to do something, to participate in an activity, rather than in some private mental epiphany.
So understanding is more about action than about having a clear mental picture.
Yes. And this applies to all sorts of situations, not just learning a skill. Think about understanding a joke, for instance. You might not be able to explain why it's funny, but you laugh. You get the punchline. You share it with others.
That's such a great example. It's like,
And
get it in the moment.
And for Wittgenstein, that getting it is what's crucial. It's about being able to participate in the language game, to respond appropriately, to move the conversation forward.
It's like we're learning to dance with language, rather than trying to dissect it under a microscope. And speaking of dancing, one of the things that really struck me about the Brown book is its sense of playfulness. Even when he's tackling these complex philosophical ideas, there's a lightness, a curiosity, almost a sense of humor that shines through.
I completely agree. Wittgenstein isn't afraid to experiment, to try out different approaches, to use everyday examples and metaphors to illuminate his points. And there's a wonderful passage in the book where he talks about philosophy as a kind of therapy, a way of untangling the knots in our thinking.
Oh, I love that idea. It's like philosophy as a tool for self-discovery, for clarifying our own understanding of the world.
And that's precisely what the Brown book offers, a kind of philosophical toolkit for examining our own linguistic habits, for becoming more aware of the traps that language can set for us, and for ultimately finding a more grounded, more authentic way of relating to the world.
And a key part of that grounding, as we've been discussing, is paying attention to the actual ways language functions in different contexts. We've already touched on his famous concept of language games. But he uses that idea to help us see how our language can sometimes create problems as well as solve them.
Yes, and I think this is where his critique of traditional philosophy comes in. He argues that many philosophical problems arise from our tendency to misunderstand the nature of language. We often try to find a single, essential meaning for a word, when in reality its meaning can shift and evolve depending on how it's used.
It's like we're trying to nail down a butterfly to a specimen board. Language is fluid,
Yeah.
dynamic, constantly in motion.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein is urging us to embrace this fluidity, this dynamism, to see that meaning is not something static, something fixed in advance, but something that emerges from the way we use language in specific situations.
So instead of searching for these abstract definitions, we should be looking at how words are actually used in different contexts, in the language games that make up our lives.
Precisely. And one of the most common ways we go wrong is by mistaking a grammatical feature of language for a metaphysical truth about the world. He uses a wonderful phrase to describe this. Language goes on holiday.
That's such an evocative image. What does he mean by language going on holiday?
He means that when we detach language from its everyday use, when we start using it in a purely abstract, theoretical way, it can lead us into all sorts of conceptual dead ends. We start asking questions that have no answers, creating problems that don't actually exist.
It's like taking a beautiful seashell out of its natural environment and trying to study it in a lab. You might learn something about its physical structure, but you'll miss the whole context, the way it lives and breathes in the ocean.
That's a wonderful analogy. And for Wittgenstein, the antidote to this philosophical seasickness is to bring language back down to earth, to look at how it actually functions in the messy, complex world of human interaction.
So he's calling for a more grounded, more empirical approach to philosophy, one that's rooted in the actual ways we use language to make sense of the world.
Exactly. He's not saying that philosophy is useless or that we should abandon abstract thinking altogether, but he is urging us to be more cautious, more self-aware, more attuned to the ways in which our language can both illuminate and obscure our understanding of reality.
You know, this is making me think about how we often use metaphors and analogies to explain complex ideas, and it seems like Wittgenstein himself is a master of this. He uses these vivid images, these thought experiments, to help us grasp these subtle but important points about language.
You're absolutely right. He's constantly using these concrete examples, these down-to-earth analogies, to bring his ideas to life. And that's one of the things that makes the Brown book so engaging, even for readers who might not have a background in philosophy.
It's like he's inviting us to play a game with him, a game of exploring language, of teasing out its hidden complexities, of seeing the world in a new light. And speaking of seeing the world in a new light, another key theme that runs throughout the Brown book is the importance of perspective.
That's a great point. Wittgenstein is constantly reminding us that our view of the world is always shaped by our language, by the concepts we use, by the ways we frame our experiences.
And that means that there's no single objective truth out there waiting to be discovered.
Well, it's not that simple. Wittgenstein is not a relativist in the sense that he believes all perspectives are equally valid, but he is arguing that we need to be aware of the limitations of our own viewpoint, that we need to be open to the possibility that there might be other ways of seeing things.
So it's about cultivating a kind of intellectual humility, a willingness to question our own assumptions and to consider alternative perspectives.
Exactly, and I think this connects back to his idea of language games. Just as there are many different language games, there are many different ways of making sense of the world, many different ways of being human, and by recognizing this diversity, this plurality of perspectives, we can open ourselves up to a richer, more nuanced understanding of reality.
This is all so thought-provoking. And as we delve deeper into the Brown Book, we'll see how these ideas about language, perspective, and understanding come together to form a truly transformative philosophical vision.
Absolutely. We'll be exploring how Wittgenstein applies these insights to a range of philosophical problems, from the nature of perception to the problem of free will.
I'm excited to continue this journey with you. Wittgenstein might be challenging our assumptions, but he's certainly not leaving us hanging. He offers us a path forward, a way of engaging with the world that is both intellectually rigorous and deeply human.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Wittgenstein's Brown Book. We've been exploring how Wittgenstein challenges us to think differently about language, meaning, and understanding.
It's been a fascinating journey so far. We've talked about language games, the importance of context, the pitfalls of abstract thinking, and the idea that our language shapes our perception of the world.
Exactly. And in this final part, I think it's worth reflecting on the broader implications of Wittgenstein's work. What does it all mean for us? Not just as philosophers, but as human beings trying to make sense of our lives.
That's a great question. One thing that really struck me throughout the Brown Book is the emphasis on the importance of clarity and precision in our use of language. Wittgenstein seems to be suggesting that many philosophical problems arise from muddled thinking, from using words in ways that don't quite match up with our actual experiences.
Yes. Think about all the philosophical debates that have raged for centuries about the nature of consciousness, free will, the existence of God. Wittgenstein might argue that many of these debates are fueled by linguistic confusion, by taking our everyday language too literally, too metaphysically.
So instead of trying to solve these grand philosophical puzzles, we should be focusing on clarifying our language, on making sure that our words are actually doing the work we want them to do.
Precisely. And this has implications not just for philosophy, but for all aspects of life. Think about the misunderstandings that arise in our personal relationships, in politics, in the media, all because of sloppy language, ambiguous terms, unexamined assumptions.
It's like we're all playing different language games without realizing it, talking past each other, creating unnecessary conflict and confusion.
Exactly. And Wittgenstein is offering us a way out of this linguistic labyrinth. He's urging us to be more mindful of the words we use, to pay attention to the subtle ways in which language can shape our thoughts and perceptions, to strive for clarity, precision, and honesty in our communication.
And this idea of honesty is interesting, because it's not just about avoiding outright lies. It's about being true to our own experiences, to the way things actually appear to us, rather than trying to force them into pre-existing categories or frameworks.
Absolutely. And this is where Wittgenstein's emphasis on the importance of describing our experiences comes in. He's constantly reminding us that philosophy should start with the concrete, with the everyday, with the way things actually show up in our lives.
And this is where his focus on examples is so important. He's always using these vivid, down-to-earth scenarios to illustrate his points, to help us see the world in a new light.
You're right. Remember his example of the person who's asked to continue a numerical series? They might not be able to articulate the rule explicitly, but they can demonstrate their understanding by correctly generating the next numbers in the sequence.
Or think about the simple language game of the builder and the assistant. It highlights how meaning emerges from practical activity, from the way we use language to get things done in the world.
Exactly. And for Wittgenstein, this is where the real meaning of philosophy lies. It's not about constructing elaborate theories or solving abstract puzzles. It's about helping us to live more clear-sightedly, to navigate the world with greater awareness and understanding.
So it's a kind of philosophical therapy, as he puts it, a way of untangling the knots in our thinking and finding a more authentic way of being in the world.
Beautifully put. And one of the key insights that emerges from the Brown Book is that this process of untangling, of clarifying, is never truly finished. Language is constantly evolving. Our understanding of the world is always shifting. And we need to be continually questioning our assumptions, refining our language, and deepening our self-awareness.
It's a humbling thought, but also an empowering one. It means that we're not trapped by our language, by our habits of thought, by the limitations of our current perspective. We have the capacity to grow, to change, to see the world anew.
And that's what makes Wittgenstein's work so relevant, so vital, even today. He's offering us a way of thinking, a way of being that is both intellectually rigorous and deeply human, a way of engaging with the world that is full of curiosity, wonder, and a profound respect for the complexity of human experience.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Brown Book, I hope you'll continue to explore Wittgenstein's ideas, to challenge your own assumptions, to play with language, and to never stop asking questions.
And remember, as Wittgenstein famously said, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. So let's expand our language, broaden our horizons, and embrace the infinite possibilities of human understanding.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining us on this philosophical adventure. We'll see you next time on Books and Bytes.